There is a silent moment when life changes direction. It's not when you gain something. It's not when someone finally recognizes your worth. It's when you realize, with an almost cruel clarity, that you've spent way too much time living as a supporting character in your own existence. Have you ever noticed how some people age on the inside before their body catches up? They keep functioning, keep delivering, keep smiling, but something inside them becomes hollow. It's as if they sold their own peace in small installments. A yes here, I'll see about it later there. I don't want conflict, repeated for years. And when they finally sit on the couch at the end of the day, they discover that silence doesn't bring rest. It accuses. Maybe you know this feeling. The feeling of always being available, always understanding, always ready to fix things, always willing to carry a little more, and still feeling like nobody really sees you. Not because people are necessarily cruel, but because you yourself taught the world to treat you like a resource, not like a person, like someone who can take it, like someone who can handle it, like someone who doesn't mind. And here lies one of the most subtle traps of adult life. You get used to being strong, and you call that a virtue. You take pride in not needing anything, and you call that maturity. You convince yourself that putting yourself first is selfish, and then you call that humility. But beneath those pretty words, there's often something far less noble. Fear. Fear of displeasing. Fear of being rejected. Fear of losing the affection that comes when you serve. Fear that without being useful, you won't be loved. Stoicism comes in like a clean blade through that tangle, not to turn you into someone cold, but to give you back a dignity you may have outsourced. Marcus Aurelius had an empire, but his struggle was intimate, not to be a slave to applause, nor a hostage to criticism, nor a prisoner of expectations. He wrote to himself like someone trying to keep his soul standing in a world that pulls it down. And what he reminds us in a very direct way is something many people avoid. You don't control what others do to you, but you do control what you allow, what you feed, what you repeat. When you put yourself first, you're not saying you don't matter, you're saying I matter too. And that simple sentence has a power that scares people because it rearranges invisible hierarchies. It messes with the silent agreements you made without realizing. I don't create problems. I don't set boundaries. I adapt. I swallow it. I wait. And the world likes those agreements, especially the people who benefit from them. But there's a price. And it's usually paid in coins that don't come back. Energy, time, health, self-respect. You start to notice that your patience has become permission, that your kindness has become an invitation to abuse, that your empathy has become an excuse for people not to change. And without realizing it, you end up living in a psychologically dangerous position, the position of someone who tries to buy peace through self-abandonment. Seneca would say that this is a waste. He wrote about time like someone who sees human tragedy with clear eyes. Many are stingy with money, but far too generous with their hours. You don't notice, but you give away a morning to a confused person, an afternoon to a problem that isn't yours, a night to an anxiety born from trying to please everyone. And when the year ends, you have the feeling that you lived a lot, without truly living. Epictetus goes even deeper. He doesn't ask if you're good, he asks if you're free. Because there's a huge difference between being a good person and being a free person. There are good people who are hostages to approval. There are good people who live as servants to other people's moods. There are good people who do good, but out of fear, guilt, neediness, out of the need to be seen as good. That isn't virtue. It's emotional dependency disguised as character. And this is where Jung can shed light on what Stoicism points to. Because behind certain good behaviors, there is a persona. The persona is the necessary social mask, the image you build to function in the world. The problem arises when you become the mask. When you believe you are only the responsible one, the calm one, the fixer, the one who doesn't bother, the one who doesn't need anything. When the persona becomes inflated, it sucks the soul dry, and the soul demands payment. Jung said that whatever you don't face in yourself, life will force you to confront on the outside. You run from inner conflict, but start attracting external conflicts. You run from setting boundaries, but end up surrounded by people with no boundaries. You run from saying no, but live surrounded by demands. You avoid choosing yourself, and the world, obedient to what you taught it, chooses for you. There is a part of you older than your good manners that knows exactly when you betray yourself. It knows when you accepted an invitation you didn't want, when you replied to messages out of obligation, when you swallowed an unfair criticism to not make a scene, when you stayed silent so you wouldn't lose someone. That part doesn't forget. It goes into the shadow. And the shadow isn't evil. The shadow is the collection of emotions, impulses, and truths you swept under the rug because you thought you weren't allowed to feel them. Anger, jealousy, the desire to be respected, the urge to leave, the need to be cared for, wounded pride, deep exhaustion. When you don't consciously make space for those forces, they come back as symptoms: irritation without reason, burnout, anxiety, bitterness, cynicism, an emptiness that nothing fills. It's as if life were saying, you can fool yourself, but you can't abandon yourself without consequences. Putting yourself first, then, isn't an act of vanity. It's an act of reintegration. It's you coming back home. It's the beginning of a life that's less reactive and more chosen. You move out of react to the world mode and start entering lead your own existence mode. And that's scary, because it demands responsibility. Whoever lives to please feels safe. There's always someone to blame, someone to follow, someone to satisfy. But whoever chooses themselves takes on a more adult task, deciding what to tolerate, what to build, what to repeat, what to end. And Stoicism doesn't romanticize this. On the contrary, it reminds you that life is short, uncertain, and often indifferent to your preferences. Precisely because of that, your attention needs to be valuable. Your energy needs to be well managed. Your peace needs to be treated as something sacred, not out of superstition but out of clarity. You don't control the passage of time, but you control what you do with it. You don't control others, but you control your stance. You don't control opinions, but you control your awareness. And perhaps the most important question in this video is simple, uncomfortable, and definitive. When was the last time you chose yourself without apologizing for existing? Because there's a kind of tiredness that isn't lack of sleep. It's lack of self. It's the body resting while the soul stays exhausted. It's the heart working but without joy. It's getting everything done and still feeling like something essential was left behind. And almost always, that something is you. Today, the proposal is clear. Look at this dynamic with courage. Without condemning yourself, without playing the victim, without turning the past into guilt. Just see it. The Stoic doesn't fight what happened. He learns from it. He doesn't drown in regret. He reorganizes the present. And Jung would say, you don't transform because you want to. You transform when you no longer have anywhere to run from yourself. If you're here, maybe it's because some part of you has already started to wake up. And when that part wakes up, everything changes. Not outside first, but inside. The world can keep being the world. People can keep being people. The difference is that you stop offering yourself as a daily sacrifice. The first thing you need to understand is that putting yourself first doesn't just cause internal change. It causes external reaction. And that isn't a sign that you're wrong. It's a sign that you've changed the invisible contract that existed between you and the world. For a long time, maybe without realizing it, you trained the people around you. You trained them with small, repeated, constant attitudes, replying quickly even when tired, accepting commitments you didn't want, tolerating invasive comments, over-explaining your decisions, apologizing for things you didn't do, smiling to end discomforts that should have been faced. Every time you did that, the world learned a simple lesson. With this person, I can go a little further. And when you finally decide to change, something curious happens. Some people don't celebrate. Some get weirded out. Others try to pull you back to the old place, not because they're monsters, but because change disrupts the structure. Your new boundary exposes their old excess, and there are people who, upon seeing you respect yourself, feel accused, even if you don't say a word. Here comes a distinction Stoicism makes with precision. You don't control people's reactions. You control your conduct. When you put yourself first, life gives you an immediate test. Will you hold your decision even when it creates discomfort? Because that's what happens. Discomfort shows up. You start saying no and feel guilty. You start stepping away from certain dynamics and feel afraid. You start prioritizing yourself and an inner voice whispers, "You're becoming selfish." That voice is old. It's the sum of all the expectations you absorbed. It's the culture of automatic sacrifice. It's the habit of confusing love with self-abandonment. Seneca talked a lot about peace of mind, not as something that falls from the sky, but as discipline. Peace isn't the absence of problems. It's clarity in the face of them. And one of the biggest sources of disturbance is precisely a life without boundaries. The mind becomes restless when yes becomes reflex and no becomes impossible. Maybe you've already experienced this. You accept something and regret it before it even starts. You agree to a visit and your chest feels heavy. You promise a favor and your body reacts as if it were a threat. But you go anyway, because you learn to betray your own will to preserve the image of being good. The Stoic teaches you something else. Preserving your soul is more important than preserving appearances. Marcus Aurelius, surrounded by people, decisions, and responsibilities, repeated to himself a fundamental reminder. Other people's opinions are volatile, and living for them is living without solid ground. Today they praise you, tomorrow they criticize you. Today they call you generous, tomorrow they call you cold. And if you depend on that thermometer, you'll never have peace. You'll be governed by an invisible audience. Putting yourself first then requires something very specific. The courage to disappoint, not out of cruelty, but out of honesty. Because when you start respecting yourself, inevitably some expectations won't be met. And that's healthy. A life in which nobody ever gets frustrated with you is, almost always, a life in which you frustrate yourself. And this is where Jung adds a decisive piece. Many people have no difficulty working, fulfilling duties, being strong. They have difficulty bearing their real self in front of others' eyes. They live to sustain a persona, and every persona has a price. It demands that you repress entire parts of your truth to keep the mask consistent. The always available person is terrified of being seen as indifferent. The always calm person is terrified of seeming difficult. The always correct person is terrified of making a mistake. The always generous person is terrified of being called selfish. And behind that, there's often a simple wound. If I'm not useful, I'm not loved. When you put yourself first, you touch that wound. You start separating love from utility. You start understanding that a healthy bond doesn't require you to erase yourself. A mature relationship doesn't ask you to disappear. True friendship doesn't punish you for having boundaries. And if it does punish you, then it isn't friendship. It's dependency, convenience, emotional possession. And look, this can hurt, because it can reveal things you'd rather not see. It can reveal that some people liked your yes more than they liked you. It can reveal that certain relationships only worked when you were beneath them. It can reveal that affection came with conditions. I accept you as long as you serve me. And that isn't love, it's a contract. The problem is that human beings cling even to what hurts, as long as it's familiar. And that's why when you put yourself first, you may feel like you're betraying your own past, like you're denying who you were. But that's not it. You're simply closing a cycle of emotional naivety. Epictetus said that it isn't the thing itself that disturbs us, but the judgment we make about it. No isn't cruel. A boundary isn't aggressive. Distance isn't rejection. These are neutral actions. What weighs is the meaning you give them. They'll hate me, so they'll abandon me. I'll be alone. I'm a bad person. And here's the point. Putting yourself first is learning not to negotiate with those fears as if they were truth. You can feel guilty and still hold the boundary. You can feel afraid and still choose what's right. You can feel discomfort and still remain faithful to yourself. Feeling isn't commanding. Feeling is just feeling. Maturity begins when you stop obeying every emotion as if it were an order. Now there's one detail many people confuse. Putting yourself first isn't doing whatever you feel like all the time. That would be childishness. Putting yourself first is acting in alignment with your values, not with impulses. Stoicism doesn't say be selfish. It says be responsible for your soul. And responsibility sometimes means saying yes to what's difficult and no to what's easy. It means saying no to an unfair demand even if it's uncomfortable. It means saying yes to self-care even if someone criticizes it. It means cutting excesses that make you sick, even if they're old habits. Let's bring this down to real life. Imagine that person who only reaches out when they need something. You always answer. Always. And one day you decide not to reply right away. Just that. A delay. A space. What happens? Maybe a complaint comes. You disappeared. Maybe drama. I thought I could count on you. Maybe a passive-aggressive hint. Now you're different. And that's when you need to realize the test isn't about response time. It's about control. Many relationships are, without people admitting it, relationships of emotional control. The person learned that to calm down, they activate you. To solve something, they use you as an extension. To avoid dealing with their own life, they transfer it to you. And you, out of fear of losing the bond, accept it. When you change, they lose a resource. And like any loss, it generates a reaction. Another example, family. Family has a special power to pull you back into an old role. You can be an adult, pay your bills, have your own life. But just walk into certain family members' homes and suddenly you're back to being the child who must obey, the person who must please, the person who can't contradict. When you put yourself first there, the shock is bigger, because the family system resists change as if it were a threat. But the Stoic isn't guided by how it's always been. He is guided by what is just, necessary, and true right now. And Jung would say, individuation is exactly that. It's stepping out of the collective destiny and becoming an individual. Not to break ties on a whim, but to stop living as a function. You stop being just the son, the daughter, the brother, the sister, the helper, the fixer, and you become you. A whole person with boundaries, with desires, with responsibility. And maybe you're thinking, but if I put myself first, I'm going to lose people. Yes, maybe. But you need to ask, lose what? Lose people who only stay when you shrink yourself? Lose relationships that depend on your exhaustion? Lose a role that makes you sick? Some losses are liberation. And here comes a hard but clean Stoic truth. You weren't made to be accepted by everyone. You were made to be whole. Integrity is when your outer life doesn't contradict your inner life. It's when your actions don't betray you. It's when you can sleep without that weight of having abandoned yourself once again. And this isn't built overnight. You'll miss the tone sometimes. You'll overdo it at times. You'll backtrack at others. You'll discover boundaries you still don't know how to hold. And that's okay. The path isn't perfection, it's practice. A simple but transformative practice starts with a daily question, almost stoic, almost brutal. Is what I'm about to do bringing me closer to a worthy life, or pushing me away from myself? Because putting yourself first isn't about winning arguments. It's about stopping losing yourself. And from the moment you stop losing yourself, something changes in the way you see things. You start noticing what used to seem normal, lack of reciprocity, excessive demands, subtle manipulation, emotional draining, and you stop calling it a phase. You call it by its name, wear and tear. And when you start calling it by its name, you stop accepting it out of habit. Putting yourself first is learning to live without asking permission to breathe. There's a common confusion that needs to be carefully dismantled. Many people think that putting yourself first is an external, almost theatrical attitude, as if it were raising your voice, imposing presence, showing your worth, demanding respect. But the real turning point is different. It happens when you change the way you govern yourself from the inside. Because what usually brings you down isn't lack of strength. It's lack of direction. You can endure. The problem is that you endure anything, and that isn't virtue. It's disorientation. Stoicism calls this emotional slavery. Not slavery with visible chains, but with internal chains. Need for approval, fear of losing affection, terror of conflict, anxiety in the face of silence, guilt for prioritizing rest. shame for saying no. And as long as those chains govern you, you may look free, but you'll live like someone who needs permission to exist. Putting yourself first through a Stoic lens is reassuming leadership over your own spirit. Epictetus starts at the beginning. What is under your control? Your choices, your opinions, your impulses, your actions. What isn't? Other people's moods, the gratitude you'd like to receive, the way they interpret your boundaries, life's fidelity to your plans. When you internalize that, the center of gravity shifts. You stop negotiating your peace with what you can't control. You stop begging the world to cooperate with your tranquility, and you start doing something more sober, building tranquility even when the world doesn't cooperate. And that's when the first great milestone of someone who puts themselves first appears, the ability to bear disapproval without falling apart. Because there's a childish part in us that believes being loved means being accepted all the time. But the adult learns. Being loved means being seen, and being seen includes both the pleasant and the firm parts. Being accepted by everyone is impossible, and trying to achieve that is a project of exhaustion. Marcus Aurelius, surrounded by intrigue, opinions, disputes, and expectations, wrote like someone reminding himself daily, "Don't depend on applause, not because applause is always bad, but because it's unstable. If you guide yourself by it, you'll bend to any wind." What the Stoic seeks isn't admiration, it's dignity. Dignity is when you can look at yourself and recognize, I didn't sell myself cheap. I didn't betray my conscience for convenience. I didn't erase myself out of fear. And that doesn't mean becoming hard or closed off. It means being whole. The whole person helps by choice, not by obligation. The whole person gives from abundance, not from neediness. The whole person loves without becoming a hostage. Now maybe you feel an inner resistance. But if I put myself first, I'll become selfish. It's a common fear. The thing is, it comes from a wrong definition of selfishness. Selfishness is placing your desires above the common good without consideration. Putting yourself first in the deep sense is preserving what makes you capable of doing good consistently. Balance, health, clarity, time, attention. An exhausted human being can still help, but helps with resentment. Helps while keeping score. Helps expecting something in return. Helps while feeling like a victim. And that kind of help poisons both the giver and the receiver. The Stoic prefers fewer actions but cleaner ones. Seneca said that a good life isn't a full life. It's a well-used life. And well-used requires discernment. You can't pour energy everywhere and expect to have soul left for yourself. There won't be any left. That's why putting yourself first is also learning to select. Select conversations. Select commitments. Select people. Select what you tolerate. Select the places where your presence makes sense. And here, Jung comes in with an uncomfortable truth. Many people don't select. They let themselves be selected. They get sucked in by whoever shouts the loudest, whoever complains the most, whoever threatens to leave, whoever makes drama, whoever blames. And deep down, they let themselves be chosen because they're afraid to choose and be responsible for the consequences. Individuation, that process of becoming who you are, requires a kind of psychological solitude. Not sad solitude, but adult solitude. The ability to stand by your decisions even when they aren't applauded, and that has a cost. Because when the world realizes you're no longer easily manipulable, it tries to use its old weapons: guilt, pity, emotional blackmail, confusion, malicious interpretation. And that's where many people back down. Not for lack of reason, but for lack of training. Stoic training isn't a beautiful theory, it's a daily practice of self-mastery. And self-mastery here isn't repression, it's sovereignty. You can feel longing and still not go back to where you were diminished. You can feel guilty and still maintain a fair boundary. You can feel love and still recognize that love doesn't fix character. You can feel the urge to please and still choose truth. That's what changes everything. You stop being governed by impulse. And that's the point where putting yourself first becomes concrete. It isn't about catchy phrases. It's about micro-decisions. You don't reply immediately when you don't have clarity. You don't over-explain to be accepted. You don't get into discussions that lead nowhere. You don't try to convince someone who's already decided to misinterpret you. You don't pick fights out of pride, but you also don't accept disrespect out of fear. You don't offer yourself as a dumping ground for emotional chaos. Life then starts to become quieter, and that silence can be scary, because you were used to living in noise. Noise of demands, noise of other people's urgencies, noise of justifications, noise of guilt. When that diminishes, you encounter a question you may have avoided for years. What do I really want to do with my life? And here lies an even deeper change. When you put yourself first, you start listening to yourself. You realize that behind a lot of patience there was fear. Behind a lot of tolerance there was neediness. Behind a lot of kindness there was an attempt to be indispensable. And behind a lot of strength there was a child trying not to be abandoned. Jung would say that this is the encounter with the shadow, not to blame yourself but to become conscious, because what isn't conscious becomes destiny. You repeat patterns, attract the same dynamics, live the same stories with different names. The Stoic does the opposite. He interrupts patterns through conscious action. And here's a powerful image: life as an inner kingdom. Who should be the king of that kingdom? Your reason, in the Stoic sense of discernment, or your fears, your consciousness or your need to please, your sense of purpose or your anxiety. If you don't govern your kingdom, someone else will. It could be a person, an expectation, an old guilt, a trauma, a desire for acceptance. But someone governs, and the price of not governing is being carried away. Putting yourself first, then, is retaking the throne. And that doesn't mean living isolated, insensitive, distant. It means living with a center. You become someone who helps without destroying yourself, who loves without humiliating yourself, who works without erasing yourself, who relates without losing yourself. And that's why the feeling of freedom grows. For the Stoics, freedom isn't doing whatever you want. Freedom is not being forced to do what you don't want out of inner weakness. Freedom is being able to say no without a long justification. Freedom is not being moved by emotional blackmail. Freedom is not explaining yourself to someone who has no intention of understanding. Freedom is choosing your stance when the world tries to pull you back into the old role. And maybe you're starting to realize, putting yourself first isn't a luxury. It's a spiritual survival necessity. Because a person who abandons themselves to keep external peace will, sooner or later, explode inside, or become bitter, or get sick, or turn cynical, or lose joy. And then, even surrounded by people, they're far from themselves. The Stoic, on the other hand, chooses the harder path at first, but the lighter one later. The discipline of being faithful to your own conscience. And if you do this long enough, something curious happens. You no longer need to prove anything. You no longer need to justify yourself. You no longer need to be understood by everyone. You just need to be consistent with what you know to be true. That is peace. And when that peace arrives, you realize that putting yourself first wasn't an act against the world. It was an act in favor of your soul. In the end, everything comes down to a simple but hard-to-sustain truth. Life responds to the place you occupy within yourself. It isn't a nice quote to put on the wall. It's a practical observation. When you live putting yourself in the background, you create a kind of silent permission for the world to treat you that way too. And when you decide to stop, the world doesn't change immediately, but you change enough not to accept the same crumbs. Putting yourself first isn't an event. It's a stance. It's a way of walking. It's a way of breathing. It's a repeated decision, especially on the days when you feel like going back to the old character, the one who takes everything, fixes everything, bothers no one. That character seems virtuous, but often it's just a well-mannered disguise for fear. Stoicism doesn't ask you to become hard. It asks you to become whole. And becoming whole begins when you stop making your own soul a secondary place. You don't need to become indifferent to be free. You need to become responsible. Responsible for what you allow, what you tolerate, what you feed, what you repeat. Stoic freedom is born when you accept that you can't control the other person's hand. but you can control the door you open, the space you offer, the value you give to what doesn't deserve it. Maybe for years you've lived a very common emotional confusion, believing that love requires constant sacrifice. And that's dangerous, because true love can demand effort, yes, but it doesn't demand self-abandonment. It doesn't require you to erase your dignity to keep the bond. It doesn't require you to shrink so the other can feel bigger. It doesn't require you to swallow humiliations to avoid problems. That isn't love, it's fear dressed up as virtue. And that's why, when you start putting yourself first, you feel guilty. Guilt is almost inevitable at the beginning because you're undoing an old conditioning. It's as if your mind were saying, if I choose myself, I'm hurting someone. But maturity is understanding a difference. Boundaries can disappoint, but they don't wound. What wounds is abuse. What wounds is disrespect. What wounds is neglect. And very often the person most neglected in your story was you. If you're honest, you'll realize most of your pain didn't come from direct malice. It came from small, repeated concessions. It came from you trying to be accepted. It came from you wanting peace at any cost. It came from you wanting to be good so you wouldn't be rejected. And that's human. It isn't reason to punish yourself, but it is reason to wake up. Marcus Aurelius reminded himself that life is brief, and that wasting energy on what doesn't depend on us is a subtle form of loss. Seneca spoke of time as the only truly irreplaceable good. Epictetus insisted on inner discipline, on sovereignty over your own choices. When you put those three together, a question you can't avoid appears. What are you doing with your life when you always put yourself last? Because there's a last that becomes a pattern, and the pattern becomes destiny. The big change isn't you becoming the center of the universe. The big change is you stopping being the dumping ground for everything. Demands, urgencies, expectations, other people's frustrations. You learn that it isn't lack of love to say, today I can't. It isn't lack of respect to step away from conversations that make you sick. It isn't selfishness to reserve time for yourself. It isn't cruelty to end cycles that diminish you. Cruelty, very often, is staying where you aren't valued, and teaching yourself that you deserve little. And here enters an even deeper dimension, which Jung would point out clearly. When you put yourself first, you stop living just to sustain a persona. You begin an intimate work of individuation. You stop living as a function, the strong one, the responsible one, the one who handles it, and start living as a human being, with boundaries, with needs, with tiredness, with truth. That truth doesn't need to be aggressive. It can be serene, but it needs to be firm. Maybe starting today your life begins to change in small gestures. A no that you hold without endless explanations. A silence you don't fill out of anxiety. A stepping away from a dynamic that always drained you. Care for your body, your sleep, your mind. A choice you make not to prove anything to anyone, but to finally respect what you've felt deep in your chest for a long time. Because, in the end, putting yourself first isn't about defeating others. It's about stopping losing yourself. And if this video touched some sensitive spot, maybe it's because you recognized something. Maybe you saw yourself in some sentence. Maybe you remembered situations where you stayed silent too much, gave in too much, tolerated too much. If that's the case, hold this idea with care. You don't need to hate yourself for what you did in the past. You just need to commit to who you will be from now on. The world may take time to understand your change. Some people may find it strange. Others may test you. Some may drift away. But the essential question is different. Will you keep abandoning yourself to keep the same story going? If you want to go deeper into this topic and turn it into practice, with more applied stoicism in daily life, more emotional clarity, and more serene strength, then I invite you to do 4 simple things here on the channel. Like the video, because that really helps the message reach more people. Subscribe to keep following content like this. Share it with someone who always puts themselves last and needs to hear this calmly. And most importantly, comment. What was the most recent situation in which you realized you were putting yourself last? Sometimes, Writing a single sentence is already the beginning of choosing yourself.